Yukon Charlie administrators deny this is a tacit policy to eliminate cabins within the preserve, even as they continue to watch the cabins go one by one 30 years after their own specialist, Melody Webb, recommended their protection. Of course, the cabins are only the outward manifestation of the larger thing that is being demolished, which is the subsistence way of life.
Welcome to the East Anchorage Book Club podcast. I'm your host, Andrew Gray. A third of all water flowing in Alaska ends up in the Yukon River. Beginning in the high country of British Columbia and flowing 2,000 miles to empty into the Bering Sea, the drainage basin of the Yukon could contain all of Texas and California together. The river discharges 12 million cubic feet of water and 100 tons of silt into the Bering Sea each minute. Fairbanks author Dan O'Neill has been enamored with the Upper Yukon for decades. In 2006, he published his travel memoir entitled A Land Gone Lonesome, an inland voyage along the Yukon River. That book was awarded the Outstanding Alaskana Award by the Alaska Library Association, was named an editor's choice by the New York Times, and was selected by National Geographic Travel as part of its ultimate travel library, along with books by John Steinbeck and Edward Abbey. Even so, it is the least well-known of Dan O'Neill's books, which is tragic, because his documentation of the subsistence lifestyle and the efforts to stamp it out through regulation are essential to understanding interior Alaska. Dan O'Neill, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
It becomes clear as we move through the book that you have decades of experience on the Upper Yukon. So can you tell us just a little bit about your attraction to the Upper Yukon and your personal history with it?
Sure. I'd come to Alaska in 1972, just sort of hitchhiking, looking around, and went back to where I'm from, which is San Francisco, for a couple of years. But then I got a chance, some pals of mine were going to float down the Yukon from Eagle to Circle in 1975, in the fall of 75. So I went up there, then 24 years old, and went on that float with those guys. And, that was kind of setting the hook for me in Alaska. And I loved it, loved the amazing, wide open spaces, the sense of true wilderness. And I went back home to San Francisco, packed up my Jeep and drove north and, have been a resident since then, which is now about 47 years.
And you've been in Fairbanks for the 47 years?
Or outside of it. My first couple of years, I was about 65 miles out of town in a little cabin. No water, no electric, wood heat, the usual. And got into dog mushing there, a little bit of trapping, and then hunting and fishing and building log cabins and all that kind of stuff. And now we've lived for 40 odd years, about 10 miles out of Fairbanks town, I guess.
Well, that's really important information because it seems like because you had that experience in the cabin 65 miles outside of Fairbanks and your own experience with trapping and, building, that you were the perfect person to write this book about the people who, most of whom seem to start in Eagle and then move out, along the river to build their own cabins and live off the land as best they could. So, you really kind of had an inside track on the difficulties that entailed and what was required. Would you say that's true?
Yeah. In 76, I guess, winter 76, 7, I was out in another little cabin, almost as far out of town, when my father would send me up by mail every so often a reprint from the New Yorker. And that was the series of articles on the Upper Yukon written by John McPhee, which became Coming into the Country, his masterpiece book. So I was out in my own little cabin with my own dog team and trying to learn about trapping and getting along in the cold and stuff. and reading about these guys out on the Upper Yukon who were basically there at the same time. Actually, McPhee was on the river when I was on the river in 1975, though I didn't bump into him. But I did bump into some of the people he wrote about. And so it was of deep interest to me. And I loved the series and loved the book. And then the next development was about 1991, the Park Service, which had come in 10 years or so earlier and established Yukon Charlie Rivers National Preserve, which took up a lot of that area McPhee had written about. They wanted to do an oral history project whereby they got down on tape, audio tape, the views of people in and around the park. So the people from Eagle Village, Circle, Central, and even people who might be along the river. And I was working at the oral history program at the University of Alaska in Fairbanks at that time. And so I really wanted to work on that project and was able to. And with my colleague, Bill Schneider, we did many interviews, scores, I guess, with both Park Service people and local people from the region over the course of probably a year or so. So I got immersed in that story and place there for quite a while. And one of the things I most wanted to do and got to do was to load up my canoe and go down the river with a tape recorder to see who I could find that was still on the river in 1991, would talk to me and deposit into the archives an oral history recording with those guys telling their story. So that was kind of all predicate to my desire to write a book on the topic. And eventually, I put together a book proposal to do that. And I was kind of fascinated by, McPhee's book was called Coming into the Country. And since then, there had been a kind of a phenomenon of coming out of the country. And a lot of these folks he had written about now were in their 40s, now had kids. And for a variety of reasons differing among families, they left their really bush life on the Yukon and came into town, usually Fairbanks, or even went outside. And that, of course, was not uncommon. That's the way that Upper Yukon had really always worked as far as white folks or people from outside. They'd come in, stayed as long as they felt like they wanted to, and then left for whatever reasons, and they were replaced by other people. That was the way the sort of social population churned for 100 and some years. So anyway, I was interested to record that phenomenon to see what was going on. How is it all these folks were departing? Were they being replaced by a younger cohort trying to do the same thing as was usual, or just what was going on? And so at some point I put together a book proposal, and it was accepted kind of enthusiastically by a fine publisher, Counterpoint Press, which was based in New York. And so I got, I should say, actually, I forgot something there. There was a period where the Park Service was interested in what they called an environmental history being written about the Upper Yukon or the Yukon Charlie area. Mm-hmm. And that's not uncommon in many of their parks. They have such books. And so they approached me with the idea, would I be interested to write under contract a book that would essentially assemble the environmental history of that region? And I had just finished a book that the Park Service helped fund on Beringia, the Bering Land Bridge. So they had some experience with me in my work and pitched me on this idea. And I thought about it and pitched back to them that what I would rather do would be to write a book in the genre of literary travel writing. And so that's not a travel log specifically, and it's not a guidebook, where to go, what to do, what to look out for. It is a literary work that takes as its subject the act of traveling through a particular area. And so that could include all sorts of natural history and human history and contemporary affairs strung along by the writer's movement through the country. I think it's a genre that was invented by Robert Louis Stevenson in the 1870s. And it's a genre I love. I love literary travel writing, and I was dying to do it. And they said, okay. So then I had a contract to produce a book of the sort I wanted to do, a subject I was dying to write about, and I got some money to do it. So it all fell into place. And then I got a publisher. On my own, and the deal I made with the Park Service was I would produce for them a manuscript, but I would own rights to the work, and I could shop it to publishers, which I did, and picked up an offer from Counterpoint, and away we went.
Well, it is a very good book, sir. You did a good job. And I want to talk about how it is in some ways a response to John McPhee. It runs throughout the book, little quotes, little responses. I would say the largest section that seems to be a response to McPhee's book would be your section on Dick Cook. I would love it if you could read on page 93 about when I related McPhee's description, my friend, who is possibly far from fastidious as anyone I know. That whole end of that paragraph is very funny about.
Okay, sure. Some years later, when Donna was long gone, a friend of mine saw Cook's cabin at Pass Creek. When I related McPhee's description, my friend, who is possibly as far from fastidious as anyone I know, wrinkled his nose and shook his head. No, it was very funky. Another former river resident who knew Cook for better than 25 years said he seemed to practice a kind of studied degeneracy. You know, if his porch overhang was sagging, he wouldn't even prop a pole under it. He just let it fall down. It was almost like he was trying to out-Slaven everybody. Like, he'd leave a piece of moose liver on the floor and then get pissed at you when you stepped on it.
Yeah, it's perfect. I think, I guess since we're talking about Dick Cook, can you explain a little bit about the importance of Dick Cook, not only as a character on the river, but also for his advocacy with his lawsuits and challenges to in support of subsistence living?
Yeah, sure. Well, it was real interesting. Of course, he was one of the people I most wanted to interview because he was the central figure in McPhee's story, I'd say, along with Ed Gelvin. But more so, I think Dick is the most memorable character in McPhee's book. And however, there was a lady up at Eagle who was head of the Eagle Historical Society, who was very wonderful local historian and who did tons of great work to protect and preserve the history around Eagle. She nevertheless was quite proprietary about the history of Eagle and kind of fenced off areas from other work researchers. And anyway, she made a big stink about me going up to interview Dick Cook, to the point where my boss told me I shouldn't do it out of deference to her wishes. So I thought that was ridiculous. Nobody owns history. But I sort of went along in that I went to his camp and I met him, and I didn't bring my tape recorder, but my eyes and ears were open. So I didn't do a formal oral history interview for the archives, which is now a terrible shame because she said she would do it and she never did it, and he died, and now it doesn't exist. So that was a real shame. But anyway, I went up there with my wife and then 6-year-old son, and he was gardening, and we had a great, hour or so together, and it was, pretty indelibly marked on my mind, everything that happened. And so I made notes later, and I was able, because he died pretty soon thereafter, I was really lucky to be able to have been able to write first person account of meeting him and what he was like, what the impression was like to be with him. And then I knew a lot of the people who knew him, lots and lots, and his former wife too, and son and her son. So I had a number of sources on Dick, and he was important, as you say, because for one thing, he was the first guy out there in the modern period. So I think he went in the late 60s. And then a lot of this group, disparagingly called back to the landers, but the younger cohort of people replicating the sourdough or pioneer experience who came along then in the early 70s and mid 70s, and as McPhee says, looked to Dick as a bit of a mentor. Although, as I say, most of these people were out there for a reason, and that is that they were pretty independent folks. So they weren't really sitting at anyone's knee, taking notes on how to live their own brand of wilderness life. But nevertheless, he was the guy who was out there first, and in the end, he was the only guy actually living away from town. Didn't have he had some kind of, usually a trailer in Eagle that he could go to, but he was based out of town, not in a village. And he was one of the few people in northern Alaska, really, who lived out away from a village as a year-round proposition and trying to support himself as best he could with trapping, fishing for dog food and stuff like that. So, and then, of course, as you alluded to, at the end there, he was finding his fishing was being restricted by the Fish and Game people, Fish and Wildlife Service people, and so he sued. And he was, in my view, dead right that what was happening is that there was being allowed a significant take of commercially caught fish, particularly at the mouth of the Yukon. And then after some of the counting took place, the Fish and Game realized, well, we haven't let enough go through. We've allowed too much commercial fishing. Now we're going to choke off the subsistence users upriver, which Dick was about the last one of. And there were some native people fishing just above Eagle Village too. And so that's completely contrary to the law. He was right. The first priority is given to the subsistence people, and yet they were the ones paying the price for a commercial overharvest. Now, admittedly, that's a tough problem because the fish have their value at the mouth. That's when they're dime bright from the sea and they are very appealing. They're still perfectly edible 1,000 miles up the river, but they weren't of commercial value there, really, mostly, I think, for cosmetic reasons, just the look of the fish. And so it's a difficult management problem to estimate, to guess how many fish are going to come through by the end of the run, and allocate, the right proportion for commercial and the right proportion for subsistence in different places all the way along a 2,000-mile migration. So I can see that that's a very, very difficult management problem, but it wasn't being fairly apportioned such that the subsistence use was assured. And that was clear, and Dick was right. He sued. And the problem, of course, was the court system was very inflexible about when he should appear. And so they required him to appear at a time when the Tetondic River, which he was living on, was running high in flood. And he ended up he was getting sideways with the court, this persnickety magistrate who didn't really understand at all the realities of rural life, insisted he come or, face the court's sanction. And so he took a chance going down his river, and it killed him. He flipped his boat and drowned there. So that was another story that was really interesting to follow, because it didn't find him for a long time. And there was a big search. And it was a very interesting thing to follow. But eventually he was found floating near the mouth of the Tetondic.
Yeah, it is definitely a sad story. It was just a real eye opener for me that, the Yukon is such an incredibly long river, and people, 1,000 miles or more away from the sea are that dependent on the fish. I really, really, really didn't realize how central the fish were to people all the way up to Eagle and into Canada.
Well, stay tuned, because this is going to be a bigger and bigger story, I think, because there are scores of villages which have depended on that king salmon run in particular for their subsistence food for hundreds of years. And we know people, I said villages, but the people we know from archaeology have depended on that fish for 8,000 years. But in the era of villages, there's scores of villages. I can't remember now the exact number, but I looked it up. And all of those people, when you think about the exigencies of living reliant on the country for your food, salmon was something that delivered itself from the far off ocean to the doorstep of these villages. Predictably, you could know when they'd be there each year. And they can be preserved very easily in a low-tech way by cutting them, hanging them, and drying them. And once dried, they were hydratable, but they were eminently perfect food for a traveling people. You could carry them light, rehydrate them, and feed them to people and dogs. So transportation and human subsistence was provided by the salmon. It is clearly the most important species in interior Alaska and Yukon. And the river actually goes all the way to British Columbia. But so that's the kind of importance. Now, hooked to that is cultural importance, because what's going on is it means that the people who are fishing are learning about boats, and in the modern era, motors and nets and fish wheels. And all that knowledge is passed down when they bring their kids out to camp every year, out to fish camp for the summer. And they connect with the elders, and they learn these ways and the ways of cutting and preserving. The whole family is involved. And there were hundreds of fish camps along the river, or maybe that's an understatement. And now they're almost all gone. And they're all gone because the king salmon run has crashed. And so, just sticking with the cultural for a minute before I go into the run, when you think about what it means to the culture when the fish camps aren't used anymore, when people aren't going to their fish camps, training up their kids, raising a potato patch, putting up the fish in a smokehouse, cutting fish, and often that cut and smoked salmon strips, as they're called, were used like money. They still are when they were still fishing. So all that goes away. And what's its substitute? What's the substitute? Well, it's to stay home in the village where there's what? Junk food from the store, TV, drugs, alcohol, a whole way of life the underpinnings of a whole way of life can come crashing down because of the decline of this particular species. And maybe that overstates it a little bit. Okay, qualified a little, but it's something close to that. And so how and why did that happen? And I've written a lot about this in otherwise. There's some in this book, but I've written book chapters and articles about the decline of the Yukon king salmon run. And it's still a controversial issue, and it is still not being accurately described by the Alaska Department of Fish and Game, because what they are inclined to do and have been inclined to do, I guess I started writing about this 16 years ago and did a bunch about 10 years ago, so I'm kind of following it, is they have not listened to the upriver fishermen, because in the upriver areas is where the decline in the salmon run will show up first. At the mouth, there's plenty of fish. They all look good. What do you know? Well, upriver, you start to see it, and throughout the last decade and more, decade and a half anyway, 20 years, a decline in the size of the fish. There's a fellow named Stanley Zuray up at Tanana, fishes at the rapids, Yukon River Rapids. He's done a multi-year careful study of the size of the Yukon kings, their weight and sex composition and stuff like that. And what you really want to put on the salmon stream is large females, because they are very fecund and they produce many times more eggs than smaller fish. And the thing about large and small is that that's kind of dependent on how many years the individual salmon stays at sea. And if they come back in 4 or 5 years, they might be fairly small. If they stay 6 or 7 years, they could be very big. And the bigger ones, like I say, produce more eggs and produce more fry. So what the Fish and Game was allowing was a large mesh drift net fishery at the mouth. And so now they allowed maybe the only, one scientist told me it may have been the only unrestricted mesh-sized salmon fishery in the world. And year after year, the upriver fishermen asked Fish and Game to lower the mesh size because they were picking off the larger fish with the large gill net mesh size, namely the large females, because the females are larger than the males. So what you're doing with that kind of mismanagement is allowing more small fish to get through. In fact, they can go through a 6-inch mesh net while the big females are caught. So you're selectively removing from the population the largest, the genes for fish to be large and fecund. Simultaneously, you're giving a reproduction advantage to smaller fish. So it's a double whammy. And this can occur in few generations. You can alter the evolution of the fish to be smaller. And it's known in evolutionary biology, and there were people pointing this out decades ago, in the 70s even. They said this population's at risk if you allow gear that removes the larger fish from your gene pool. It's even true in every other species, including humans, where you stress a population, like in a human war zone, breeding occurs at a younger age. So it should have been known. It should have been clear. It's still not acknowledged. They finally, under pressure, acknowledged that the size is smaller. But that took it took years of arguing with them. And for years, when I was doing my work, which is a while ago now, 10 years ago now, I guess, I looked through 20 years of Port of Fish meeting minutes and saw there repeated proposal by upriver fishermen from Tanana and Fort Yukon and Eagle to lower the mesh size, to reduce the length of the net, to reduce the depth of the net, to close down the season, to reduce the take, every kind of conservation measure you could think of. And in every single case, the Alaska Department of Fish and Game opposed the measure or argued against it, declaring neutrality, and otherwise presided over no action. No action was taken by the Board of Fish with the concurrence of ADF&G. So they are a big part of the problem. They want to point the finger out to the ocean and say it's large-scale forces like the warming of the ocean. It could be, they say, the pollock fishery intercepting kings. All of these forces that may certainly play a role, but conveniently they're beyond the scope of their ability to regulate. Well, what's not beyond the scope is the in-river fisheries management, which they are in charge of and which they decline to activate in a responsible and conservative way for decades.
So two things I'll say where your book really supports the knowledge of the Upper Yukon fishermen, which is number one, that they discovered the parasite earlier because they noticed the change in smell and they saw what they saw on the organs. They saw the little white dots, and no one, and you know, initially scientists from outside said it wasn't even possible on the Upper River Yukon. So it took years for them to prove that was indeed happening. The other thing is, and I'm trying to find it. I'm trying the guy who when they came to sample the water, he went out and asked if they were noting how high the river was when they were checking the water, because obviously the quality of the water would change drastically if there had been a big rain and the river was high, or if there hadn't been and the river was low, that everything in the terms of the quality of the water would change based on the level of the river. And of course, the scientist was like, no, we don't record that at all. We just, I show up on this day and I sample the water, and that's the quality that I record.
Yeah, I think that was Mark Richards on the Candic.
Yes.
And it's a very good example of the value to science, to the work of scientists, to involve the local people, because that's something that would seem absolutely second nature to a guy who lived on the river, that when it rains a lot, you leach all these tannins and dirt out of the soil, adjacent soil, and the river runs high and dirty. And so if you weren't correlating river height to turbidity or other water quality measurements, you were missing a rather important variable. And anyway, there's tons of examples. I'm constantly blown away by just how brilliant, really, so many of these rural people are, and how valuable they are to science. Like people like Stan Zaray with his data gathering. He's produced the most extensive and reliable data on the Chinook run in the Yukon in existence. And he's someone who has he doesn't have a college degree or anything like that. And then Bill Flores was the fellow who you referred to, who discovered the parasite Ichthyophonus in the Yukon king salmon. And he could not, for years, he couldn't get anyone interested in this as a potential problem and something that ought to be reckoned with in management policies. It was possible that this disease killed fish before they reached their spawning grounds, particularly the ones who migrated a long way up into Canada, say. And if that was so, then obviously you'd have to adjust your escapement levels to make sure that if you lost a fraction that got by your counter, you'd still have enough at the far end. Well, nobody took this up until finally Bill sent an email to Bill was a computer guru in Tanana. He had all kinds of equipment, and everybody went to him when they had a problem. And so he was on the internet a lot, and he found out who was sort of Mr. Ichthyophonus. He zeroed in on that parasite because he finally got a Fish and Wildlife Service guy to give him some proper jars to collect samples in that would preserve it without rotting it, and not, but where you didn't have to freeze it, which would kill the parasite. So anyway, he finally got that after some years, where he got a lab report saying the bug they found in there was Ichthyophonus. But that's just one sample, one lab, 1 year. Well, anyway, he contacted Mr. Ichthyophonus, a fellow named Dick Kosan at the University of Washington, who'd written extensively about this, clearly the world expert, and just said, I think I got this in the Yukon River and king salmon. And Kosan told me, I didn't believe that for a second. I think he said it had never been discovered north of the Aleutian chain and was never found in wild salmon, period. And so he didn't believe it at all. But he told me I didn't want to put the guy off just cold like that. So I told him, look, if you could get some money for me and an assistant to come to up there and sample at 2 places on the Yukon River, I'll spend my vacation and come up there and do it. And he said, I thought I'd never hear from the guy again. Well, like a day later, Bill was on the phone with him saying, I've got your money. And he was a hustler. He got the money out of Bering Sea Fishermen's Association, I think it was. And Dick started packing. It was May already. The fish were going to come in June. And he got up there and he flew into Tanana first. And Bill picked him up and took him to his cabin. And Kosan said, I couldn't believe it when I walked in this guy's cabin. He had more electronics than I do at my lab at the university, And
yeah, he said he had like 5 computers, and I mean, yeah, it was a lot.
Yeah, like I say, these guys are sharp. So anyway, then they jump in the boat, go up to Bill's fish camp, and grab a few fish out of the fish reel, go in the tent where he would cut his fish, slice it open, and Kosan said, quote, holy Christ, I couldn't believe it. They were loaded with Ichthyophonus. He could tell with his eye. Mm-hmm. And so he thought this was a major scientific discovery of significance to fish managers, fisheries managers. And so he did his little work there, this sort of quickie sampling, and showed, sure enough, there were also differences in the percentage of infection, the mouth versus middle river versus up toward the end. With the mouth, there wasn't very much showing, a small percentage, let's say on the order of 10, I'm guessing. But then by the middle river, let's say it was up 25, I'm guessing. But then by the end, it had dropped down a bunch. Now, what could account for that? Well, what could account for that is that the disease was growing as they came into warmer water. And then it took an effect on them such that it killed them before they reached spawning ground. That's a possible explanation. Well, it's a pretty damn worrisome explanation. And Fish and Game didn't really want to hear it. And Dick went outside and wrote a proposal and got his own funding and came up and did a 5-year study and showed it was so. And all throughout this, Fish and Game was putting out in-house papers disputing his methodology, disputing his conclusions, and so on and so forth. None of those people writing those in-house reports had a fraction of the experience as this professor with fish diseases or with this disease in that river, because he had just done a 5-year study.
Right.
And when Fish and Game had been given a $500,000 grant to do work on this decline, and Kosan was not offered a penny of that. So, instead, the Ichthyophonus research conducted by ADF&G was conducted by someone with zero experience in fish diseases, and really without a graduate degree in anything. So the avoidance of the expert and the refusal to take his conclusions and recommendations was singular.
Mm.
And I'll finish that story off by saying that Fish and Game tried repeatedly to publish in the scientific world, at scientific journals, their in-house paper suggesting that ichthyofaunus was having little effect.
Mm-hmm.
It was rejected at peer review, a rather unprecedented 3 times. Usually, if you're told no twice, you go away and figure out what you're doing wrong. 3 times it was rejected. A counter article was written and accepted at the lead journal of the American Fisheries Association on first submission. And its lead author was Stanley Zaray, the Tanana fisherman with no degree, and co-authored by Richard Kosan, the Mr. Ichthyofaunus. So it was the outside, unbiased scientific community completely validated the work of Kosan and Stan Zaray, and completely invalidated the story that the Alaska Department of Fish and Game people were pushing.
Mm. It's a great story. I want to go back to Dick Cook. I wanted to say that description that we read of how, his very slovenly cabin, nothing upkept, things sagging, things falling apart, that was not the typical way that cabins were maintained. And I feel that your book, in many ways, is a memoir of the cabins along the Yukon. And so I wonder if you can just talk about the importance of the cabins and, and what they mean to the history, and maybe how their destruction is a loss of an important cultural artifact.
Well, I certainly believe that what you said there at the end. McPhee showed very well, I thought, how important the cabins are in rural Alaska when he told the story of the flyer who crashed and was the sole survivor on the Upper Charlie River, and survived only because as he wandered downriver, he came upon a cabin, and the cabin had some food in it and an axe, and he could stay warm and eat and recoup from his injuries and equip himself for the walk out. And that's traditional in the interior of our subcontinent up there, that people understand that emergencies occur, and cabins were typically left unlocked and stocked, and even with a fire laid in the stove, and the expectation that the cabin would be left as good as it was found, though people didn't expect to be repaid necessarily for the emergency use of food or something like that. But anyway, it happens that in the institutional culture of the Park Service, they've had a policy of getting rid of structures in newly acquired parkland, and it's been a big mistake. A big mistake. In my book, I simply quote a number of Park Service career people who point this out all over the system. They knocked down the ranchers' cabins at Big Bend National Park, and they did the same thing in the Smoky Mountains, and they did the same thing in Chaco Canyon, and on and on and on. And then they regretted it. They realized that they didn't consider it history at the time, but as the years go by, those were historical structures that beautifully illustrated a period of that park's history. So I thought that's what's happening here in Yukon Charlie as well, that really the people were being eliminated by regulation. The cabins were being torn down or neglected such that they fell down, or allowed to burn down by declaring them not on the list to protect. And I thought that was short-sighted. And so I got into that a fair bit.
To a city dweller such as myself, I always imagined that these people would leave Eagle and go, build their cabin and live there. What I didn't realize is that then they would build another cabin 15 miles up and another cabin 15 miles up. And so they had, they built many cabins. There was a long series of cabins that were being built. And I think that was a surprise for me, was just how many cabins one person might build in their however many years living on the river.
Yeah. And I have pals who take a more hard line from environmentalist point of view, even though I count myself as an ardent environmentalist. But that was what was necessary, really, to survive in that country. So you could fish in summer, and then that meant a fish camp somewhere. That could be just a tent frame, like a platform and a superstructure over which you threw your canvas tent or something like that. But it was kind of your place year after year. You knew you had your own eddy and your smokehouse there. And so that was, but these are, as McPhee said, very biodegradable structures. It's kind of like stick culture. Everything is built with sticks, and ultimately it can rot into the ground. But then for cash, you needed some money to buy kerosene and 30-06 shells and make a trip to town once in a while to see a dentist maybe. And so you needed to make cash by trapping in the modern period. Earlier days, there were steamboat wood to cut and wage work at roadhouses or freighting or accommodating geological field trips and stuff like that. But in the modern period, there wasn't any of that. So they had to fur trap for money. So that meant you needed a certain amount of fur to buy those things I mentioned that you couldn't make yourself. So that meant a certain degree of range that you had to cover with your trap lines. And back when it used to be cold in Alaska, it was kind of impossible to do that. It wasn't impossible, but it was pretty damn hard to have a sufficiently large trap line without a line cabin. So they'd go up a day's journey out their line and put up a little log cabin. And often these could be like even 5 by 7 feet. McPhee, I found this letter of McPhee wrote to the Secretary of the Interior. And he didn't even remember he wrote it, but he said I could use it. And he described these cabins. In fact, suppose I read that little bit.
Sure.
I love this part. He's talking to Cecil Andrus, Secretary of the Interior, at a time before Anilka's passed, and McPhee's advocating for recognizing this subsistence lifestyle as important, which the act ultimately did. So McPhee had this to say: "It seems to me that these needs are modest. The cabins are small. 5 or 6 would fit in your private office." I love that. You could hear Andrus gulp right there. And they're scattered through the forest, through the forest, and they are biodegradable. The people are small, and they are scattered through the forest, and they are biodegradable. I feel that the subsistence living they practice is important to us all. That it's not just an isolated pocket of nostalgia in a technological world, and that it is as worthy of preservation as any aspect of Alaska. So I feel that way too. And but the thing I knew that McPhee didn't know was that it wasn't going to work out that way. That while Anilka did specify that subsistence activities as practiced by white and Native people in rural Alaska were a cultural value, nevertheless, the regulations promulgated by the agency, an agency of considerable institutional inertia. Those all but took away the opportunity for people to practice particularly a resident subsistence lifestyle in the park. They made it easier for them to move to town and go into the park like on a day basis, but you couldn't go from Eagle to the Kandik, which is like 80 miles, and trap up the Kandik and come back in a day. You needed a cabin, and you couldn't do all your trapping in a day. So essentially, they made regulations that put out of business anybody. And in short order, there simply were no people, and there are no people in that park practicing a resident subsistence lifestyle. They presided over its elimination.
Right. And you quoted Melody Webb a lot and referenced her book. She had been the park historian, or the national parks historian, who acknowledged, I believe, that Anilka had the right intention, had the right language to say they were going to honor the subsistence lifestyle. But I think she also agreed that the way it was implemented and the regulations that came down did not honor it, but eliminated it.
Yeah. I didn't have to argue this personally. I could just put people like Melody Webb on the stand.
Yeah.
Dave Evans and Zorro Bradley and lots of folks who were career Park Service people, have nothing but hope for the Park Service and love of Alaska, who truly tried to make the implementation of Anilka honor and care for subsistence practices, and they lament that it just didn't happen.
Right. You know, on page 188, you actually write very specifically about the Park Service, you know, the way the Park Service handled the cabins and what the result was. I think it's kind of a long paragraph, but I would love it if you just read the whole paragraph, because it's exactly what we're talking about, starting with at the bottom of page 188, accepting the handful of public use cabins that the Park Service maintains.
Okay. Accepting the handful of public use cabins that the Park Service maintains, the life cycle of a log cabin in this preserve is a short arc into the moss. No one is allowed to live in the cabin and thus to maintain it. No one is allowed to repair the cabin when deterioration shows. The Park Service does not employ so much as a tarp to protect the structure from water damage and rot. Protection from wildfire is not recommended. Inevitably, the roof begins to go. Either the cabin burns or neglect continues until the cabin falls in by natural processes. Alternately, the cabin is declared a threat and a nuisance and demolished. Yukon Charlie administrators deny this is a tacit policy to eliminate cabins within the preserve, even as they continue to watch the cabins go one by one, 30 years after their own specialist, Melody Webb, recommended their protection. Of course, the cabins are only the outward manifestation of the larger thing that is being demolished, which is the subsistence way of life.
Yeah.
I still believe that it's the visible symbol, but the real loss is that we don't have those people out there anymore.
Right.
And, living that life, continuing that tradition, even just making stories, experiences that become attached to that landscape. As we revere the old stories of the old residents, we're seeing the end of the creation of that kind of oral history tradition.
I'd love to end our time today with you reading that paragraph that starts with "I drift by in silence" on page 143 at the top.
Oh, yeah. Actually, I like that Ivy City bit.
Oh, yeah. The Ivy City bit is wonderful.
And this is something that, my other books are straight reportage. Mm-hmm. I'm not in it. It wouldn't be appropriate.
Right.
But for this book, because of its structure, I am in it. And right. The structure is basically I put my canoe in upriver and go downriver. And as I enter a particular locale, I pull a boat into shore and climb the bank and go into its history and the people who were there or the events that took place there or the natural history that something there suggests. And so that's the structure, is this linear up to down river, but branching off into the stories of the country. So that my part in it is only a tiny percentage, but it's something the reader can come back to at the end of each story. We get back in the boat and go another.
I just decided, go ahead and read all of Ivy City. I mean, it's only another paragraph. It's probably the shortest chapter in the book. I'll have you read the whole chapter.
It is the short. Okay, Ivy City. Somewhere along the left bank below Nation Reef and above Shelley Creek is the town of Ivy City, now vanished. Even 30 years ago, Melody Webb and Dave Evans couldn't find it. Just about every available force of destruction contributed to its disappearance. First, its rival, Nation City, was more conveniently situated to serve the 4th of July mines, so Ivy City declined. Rain and rot and the regrowth of vegetation worked away at the remains until a man named Alvin Arp assisted the reclamation. He built a cabin nearby and cut up the old buildings of Ivy City to burn for firewood. Then in 1969, a forest fire erased the whole shebang. Now, with the trees grown up again, it would take a metal detector to prove the town was ever here, to find the spikes and hasps and tin cans hidden between the trees beneath the forest duff. I drift by in silence, pondering a country where towns are as ephemeral as footprints in the snow. I can see no sign of the old settlement, but I sense an absence hereabouts. It's a condition of emptiness that I feel in my gut, as if the town had vaporized in an instant, and the vacuum tugs at my viscera. It's like when matter converts to energy in a nuclear explosion, only this was cultural matter, and it converted to a psychic energy, the best name for which is loneliness.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for being here today, and thank you for the book. There were so many things I wanted to talk about that we didn't get to. I mean, I would say that what I had, like, with a bunch of exclamation marks, is that we had to talk about Vogler. We had to talk about, the most famous, person on the river, and him getting Wally Hickel elected. But anyway, that's just a teaser for listeners that they need to read the whole book, because there's so many wonderful stories in it.
Yeah, well, I particularly appreciate you featuring the book, because I sent you an email just before we got on, but it gives some of the review blurbs and stuff like that. And it won some awards too. And I never see it on a bookstore shelf.
The book is A Land Gone Lonesome by author Dan O'Neill. For those who love Alaska, this is essential reading, and the book is still in print. I recommend it to everyone. Huge appreciation to Dan O'Neill for being on the show. He will be back in a few weeks to discuss another of his books, The Last Giant of Beringia, The Mystery of the Bering Land Bridge. And in December, we will talk to him about his most famous work, The Firecracker Boys. Thank you to Corey Coolidge for making this podcast listenable. Please check out his website, anchoragelife.net, and the YouTube channel by the same name about life in our city. Thank you to our listeners. If you like what you heard, please subscribe, rate, and review us.